The grand arena of the Zerrin Empire was silent. Thousands of alien spectators filled the massive structure, their glowing eyes fixed on the two warriors standing in the center. On one side was Princess Scifi, heir to the Zerrin throne, known for her unmatched combat skills. On the other side stood a single human, a man who looked too ordinary to be in such a place. Captain Elias Carter adjusted his grip on his sword, his expression calm despite the overwhelming attention. He knew what everyone was thinking. A human had no place in a duel against a Zerrin royal. But here he was, standing in front of an opponent far stronger, faster, and more experienced than him. The Zerrin were a warrior race, ruling over dozens of planets through their superior strength and advanced technology. They considered humans weak, barely above primitive creatures. But when humanity refused to bow to their rule, the Empire demanded a demonstration of power. A duel. A fight to prove that no human could ever stand against a true warrior. Zyra stepped forward, her tall and elegant form covered in battle armor that shimmered under the bright arena lights. Her deep violet skin glowed faintly, and her sharp golden eyes studied Elias with mild curiosity. She had fought many battles, but had never faced a human in combat before. "You are brave," she said, her voice carrying across the arena. "Or perhaps foolish. Do you understand the honor of fighting me?" Elias smirked. "I understand that you think you've already won." A murmur spread through the audience. No one spoke to a Zerrin princess like that. Zyra narrowed her eyes, but did not let the insult shake her. Instead, she simply raised her weapon, a long, curved blade humming with energy. "The fight begins now," announced the High Commander, standing above the arena. A deep gong echoed through the air. Zyra moved first. She was fast. Too fast. In the blink of an eye, she was already in front of Elias, her blade slicing through the air. Most warriors would have been cut down instantly. But Elias had spent years fighting against stronger enemies, and he knew one simple truth. Power meant nothing if you couldn't land a hit. He dodged. The crowd gasped. Zyra's blade missed by inches, slicing through empty space where Elias had been standing a moment ago. She spun, aiming another strike. But Elias ducked, narrowly avoiding the attack. Zyra frowned. Humans were not supposed to be this fast. Elias countered. He swung his sword at her side, but Zyra easily blocked it. Sparks flew as their weapons clashed. She pushed him back effortlessly, forcing him to take several steps away. "You're not weak," she admitted, "but you will lose." Elias didn't respond. Instead, he watched her movements carefully. The Zerrin fought with absolute confidence, expecting their enemy to fall quickly. That was their weakness. They had never faced someone like him before. Zyra lunged again, this time moving even faster. She aimed for his shoulder, but Elias sidestepped, then parried her next attack. She swung high, low, and sideways, yet every strike was either dodged or deflected. The more she fought, the more frustrated she became. Why wasn't he falling? Why wasn't he afraid? Elias saw the shift in her expression. She was confused, and that was exactly what he wanted. "You're strong," he said, stepping back slightly, "but you rely too much on your strength." Zyra clenched her jaw. "And you rely too much on luck." She charged again, but this time, Elias moved differently. Instead of just dodging, he struck back with precision. A quick step to the right, a sharp counterstrike, a shift in position. Suddenly, Zyra found herself on the defensive. The human was learning. The crowd grew restless. The Zerrin had expected a short fight, but minutes passed, and Elias was still standing. More than that, he was fighting back. Zyra gritted her teeth. Enough. She had to end this now. With a deep breath, she tightened her grip and unleashed her full speed, her blade cutting through the air like lightning. Elias barely had time to react. He raised his sword just in time, but the force of the impact sent him skidding backward. His arms ached, his breath was heavy, but he did not fall. He smiled. That's more like it. Zyra's eyes narrowed. Why was he smiling? For the first time in her life, Princess Zyra realized she was not just fighting the human. She was fighting something far more dangerous, a warrior who refused to lose. And deep down, a part of her felt something she had never felt before. Doubt. The clash of metal echoed through the grand arena, the energy-charged blades sending sparks into the air. Thousands of Zerrin spectators watched in stunned silence, their glowing eyes fixed on the battle. No one had expected this. Princess Zyra, heir to the mighty Zerrin Empire, was supposed to finish this fight in seconds. A human should not have lasted this long against her. Yet Elias Carter was still standing. Zyra exhaled slowly, adjusting her stance. Her blade felt heavier than before, not because of exhaustion, but because of something more frustrating. Doubt. She tightened her grip. No, she wouldn't let herself be shaken by a human. She was Zerrin. She was trained from childhood to be a warrior, an elite among elites, and yet every time she attacked, Elias dodged, parried, or countered just in time. His movements were calculated, his reactions sharp. He was learning. The human was adapting to her speed. Zyra's golden eyes locked onto Elias. His breathing was heavier, and sweat ran down his face, but his expression remained calm, focused. "You're starting to slow down," Elias said, smirking slightly. Zyra felt a flicker of irritation. Was he mocking her? "Confidence doesn't win battles," she replied coldly. "Neither does blind strength," Elias shot back. That made her jaw tighten. Zyra had fought countless battles, but never had an opponent spoken to her with such defiance. Most warriors crumbled before her presence, overwhelmed by her skill and power. But Elias stood his ground. She lunged forward, her blade slicing through the air with incredible speed. This time, she changed her technique. Instead of overwhelming him with strength, she feinted, making it seem like she would strike from the right, but shifting her attack at the last second. For the first time in the battle, Elias was too slow to react. Zyra's blade grazed his shoulder, cutting through his uniform and drawing a thin line of blood. The crowd erupted into cheers. Elias stumbled back, clutching his wound. It wasn't deep, but the pain burned. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Okay, that was a good one." Zyra didn't reply. She had no intention of letting him recover. She pressed forward, attacking with sharp, precise strikes. Elias barely managed to block the first two, but the third sent his sword flying out of his hands. The weapon clattered to the ground, sliding several feet away. A heavy silence fell over the arena. Zyra pointed her blade at Elias's chest. "It's over." She expected him to surrender. Any sane warrior would. But instead of giving up, Elias grinned. Zyra frowned. "What's so funny?" Elias moved. Faster than anyone expected, he lunged, not for his weapon, but straight at her. Zyra's eyes widened in shock as Elias dodged her blade and grabbed her wrist. Before she could react, he twisted her arm slightly, forcing her grip to loosen. Her sword slipped from her fingers. The crowd gasped. Zyra tried to pull away, but Elias took another step forward, using her own momentum against her. In an instant, their positions had reversed. Elias now held her arm in a firm lock, while her weapon lay useless on the ground. For the first time in her life, Princess Zyra was unarmed. A deep murmur spread through the audience. The Zerrin High Commander stood abruptly, eyes narrowing. Zyra's breathing was steady, but her heart pounded in her chest. How had this happened? How had a human, a species her people considered weak, managed to disarm her? Elias didn't gloat. He simply stepped back and released her. "You rely too much on your blade," he said. "A weapon is just a tool. The real fight is here." He tapped the side of his head. "And here." He pointed at his chest. Zyra stared at him, her golden eyes unreadable. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. No one had ever challenged her like this. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, to everyone's shock, Tyra smiled. A small, almost imperceptible smirk. She bent down, picked up her sword, and held it at her side. "You're interesting, human," she said. "This fight isn't over." Elias grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." The battle was far from finished, but something had changed. This was no longer just a duel for dominance. It was a test of who they truly were. The air in the arena was thick with tension. Every Zerrin in the audience held their breath, their glowing eyes locked on the two fighters standing in the center. Princess Zyra had been disarmed. A human had done the impossible. But the fight was not over. Zyra lifted her sword again, her grip tightening. This was no longer just about winning. Something inside her burned, not with anger, but with curiosity. How had this human managed to stand against her for so long? What made him so different from the warrior she had crushed before? Elias Carter rolled his shoulder, wincing slightly. The wound she had given him still stung, but he didn't let it slow him down. He watched Syrah carefully, noticing the change in her stance. She was thinking. Before, she had fought like a trained warrior, sharp, precise, and overwhelming. Now, she was watching him, studying him. He smirked, finally taking me seriously. Syrah tilted her head slightly. "You earned it." Then she attacked. This time, her movements were different. She didn't try to overpower him. She tested him. Each strike was controlled, calculated. Elias had to be faster, smarter. He dodged, deflected, and countered, but Syrah was adapting, quickly. For the first time since the battle began, Elias felt real pressure. Zyra's sword came from the left. He blocked. She spun low, aiming for his legs. He jumped back. But the moment his feet touched the ground, she was already there. Her blade stopped just inches from his throat. The crowd roared. Elias froze, breathing hard. His own sword was raised, but just a second too slow. He sighed. That was fast. Zyra lowered her weapon, stepping back. "You learn quickly, but so do I." Elias smiled. "I noticed. The battle should have ended there." The princess had won, but instead of calling the match, Zyra did something no one expected. She turned to the High Commander sitting in the royal balcony. "I request a rematch." A wave of murmurs spread through the arena. A rematch. She had won. Why ask to fight again? The High Commander narrowed his eyes. "You defeated him, Princess. There is no need to." "I was careless." Zyra interrupted, her voice strong. "This human is not like the others. He fights with skill and intelligence. I do not wish to win because of a single mistake." She turned back to Elias. "I want to fight again. A real fight." Elias blinked in surprise. He had expected her to be proud, maybe even arrogant about her victory. But instead, she was offering him another chance. He grinned. "You're serious?" Zyra nodded. Elias chuckled. "All right, Princess. Let's do this properly." The High Commander hesitated. Then, seeing the fire in Zyra's eyes, he gave a sharp nod. "Very well. The match continues." The crowd erupted in excitement. No one had ever seen a fight like this before. Zyra and Elias took their positions again, facing each other. The air between them crackled with energy. This time, it wasn't just a duel for honor. It was a battle between two warriors who refused to lose, and neither of them was backing down. The arena was louder than ever. No one had expected a rematch. No one had expected a human to push Princess Zyra to this level. Elias Carter tightened his grip on his sword, rolling his shoulders. His body ached from the previous fight, but his mind was sharp. He had a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. Princess Zyra stood tall, her glowing eyes locked onto his. She had fought many warriors in her life, but never someone like Elias. He was unpredictable, smart, dangerous in a way she had never faced before. She raised her sword. "Let's finish this, human." Elias smirked. "After you, princess." The battle began. Zira moved first, closing the distance in a blink. She slashed at Elias's side, but he dodged, twisting his body just in time. He countered with a sharp strike toward her shoulder. She deflected. He stepped in closer. She kicked forward. Elias barely avoided the hit, rolling to the side. Zira didn't give him time to breathe. She was already on him again. Strike after strike, faster than before. Elias blocked, but he was getting pushed back. She was stronger, faster, more experienced. The crowd could see it too. The princess was winning. But then, Elias changed his approach. Instead of meeting her strength with strength, he started using her speed against her. He sidestepped instead of blocking, forcing her to adjust. When she swung hard, he leaned back just enough to dodge, making her overextend. She growled in frustration. Elias smirked, getting tired. Zira narrowed her eyes. Not even close. She lunged forward, aiming for his chest. Elias twisted, but instead of dodging completely, he let the blade scrape against his shoulder, just enough to trap her sword. Zira's eyes widened. In that split second, Elias stepped in close, his own sword stopping just inches from her neck. The arena fell silent. For the first time, Princess Zira had been caught off guard. She looked at the blade so near to her throat. Then, slowly, she stepped back. She had lost. The crowd didn't know what to do. Some gasped. Others whispered. But the High Commander stood from his seat, his expression unreadable. Zira took a deep breath, then turned to Elias. "You fought well." Elias lowered his sword. "So did you." There was no mockery in his voice, no arrogance, just respect. For a moment, Zira studied him. Then she did something no one expected. She extended her hand. Elias blinked in surprise. Then, with a small smirk, he reached out and shook it. The crowd exploded in cheers, a human and a Zeren warrior, showing mutual respect. It was unheard of. The High Commander stepped forward. His voice echoed through the arena. This battle was not just about skill. It was a battle of will, of heart. He looked at Elias, and this human has proven himself worthy. Zira nodded. Yes, he has. Elias chuckled, glad to hear it. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The battle had ended, but something far greater had just begun. The echoes of the battle still lingered in the air. Elias Carter had done the impossible. He had fought Princess Zira to a standstill, and now, instead of treating him like an enemy, she regarded him with something new: respect. The High Commander's words still rang in Elias's ears. This human has proven himself worthy. As the crowd cheered, the tension in the air slowly faded. Zira had never lost a duel before. And yet, as she stood there, breathing heavily, she did not feel humiliated. She felt curious. How had a human, a species her people thought of as weak, managed to match her in combat? She turned to Elias, who was wiping sweat from his brow. He looked exhausted but proud. "You fight differently," she said at last. "Not just with strength, but with your mind." Elias grinned. "That's what humans do. We adapt." Zira folded her arms. "I see that now." The High Commander approached, his gaze shifting between them. This battle was meant to be a test, a show of strength between our two peoples, but it has become something greater. Zira raised an eyebrow. "Greater?" The commander nodded. "It has proven that humans and Zeren are not so different after all." He glanced at Elias. "You fought without fear, without hatred, and despite our traditions, you stood as an equal." Elias chuckled. "I appreciate the compliment." But before anyone could speak further, another voice interrupted. "This is unacceptable." A tall Zeren warrior stepped forward, his expression dark. He was General Kaylor, one of the most powerful military leaders in the Empire. His silver armor gleamed under the arena lights. Zyra stiffened. She knew Kaylor well. He was ruthless, traditional, and he despised humans. Kaylor's eyes burned with anger. This human should not be honored. He is an outsider, a lesser being, and yet you call them worthy. The crowd fell silent. Many Zerin agreed with Kaylor's views. They believed humans were weak, unworthy of standing beside their kind. Elias sighed. Here we go again. Zyra stepped forward. General, Elias has already proven himself in battle. Are you questioning the High Commander's decision? Kaylor sneered. I am questioning the wisdom of honoring a human at all. He turned to the commander. This cannot stand. The princess must prove herself again, against a true opponent. Zyra narrowed her eyes. Are you suggesting you should fight me? Kaylor smirked. No, princess. I suggest that he fights me. The air in the arena grew heavy. Another battle. Against Kaylor. Elias looked at the towering warrior, who was even larger than Zyra. His muscles were like steel, his stance firm. He wasn't just a warrior. He was a war machine. Zyra clenched her fists. This is unnecessary. Elias already fought with honor. Kaylor's eyes gleamed with challenge. Then let him prove it again. The High Commander remained silent for a long moment. Then, at last, he spoke. Very well. The human shall fight Kaylor. Zyra turned sharply. Commander. But Elias raised a hand. It's fine, princess. He grinned. I never back down from a challenge. Kaylor smirked. Then prepare yourself, human. Because this time, you won't walk away so easily. Elias tightened his grip on his sword. He could feel it. This battle was going to be different. This wasn't just a fight. It was war. The arena had fallen into an uneasy silence. Kaylor's challenge was more than just words. It was a threat. Elias could feel the tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This fight would not be like the last one. Across from him stood General Kaylor, his massive form towering over Elias. His silver armor shone brightly in the light, and his eyes gleamed with cold confidence. Elias had faced many battles, but this was different. Kaylor was a beast, a warrior forged for war. Elias took a deep breath. He had faced Princess Zyra's strength, but now he was about to face a man who lived for the battlefield. The High Commander stepped forward, his voice steady and authoritative. The rules remain the same. No weapons other than swords. The battle will continue until one fighter yields. Zyra looked at Elias, concern written on her face. Are you sure about this? Elias nodded. I don't back down. Kaylor's laughter echoed in the arena. Brave words, human. But they won't save you. Elias gripped his sword tighter, ready for whatever Kaylor had in store. His mind raced, thinking of every strategy he had learned, every tactic he had used in the past. Kaylor charged first, his speed terrifying. He swung his sword with incredible force, aiming to crush Elias with the power of his blow. Elias barely managed to step aside, the air from the swing grazing his cheek. Kaylor didn't pause. He pressed the attack, his sword strikes coming in fast and brutal, each one with the intent to end the fight in a single blow. Elias had to think quickly, or he wouldn't last. How had a human, a species her people thought of as weak, managed to match her in combat? She turned to Elias, who was wiping sweat from his brow. He looked exhausted but proud. You fight differently, she said at last. Not just with strength, but with your mind. Elias grinned. That's what humans do. We adapt. Zyra folded her arms. I see that now. The High Commander approached, his gaze shifting between them. This battle was meant to be a test, a show of strength between our two peoples, but it has become something greater. Zyra raised an eyebrow. Greater. The commander nodded. It has proven that humans and Zerin are not so different after all. He glanced at Elias. You fought without fear, without hatred, and despite our traditions, you stood as an equal. Elias chuckled. I appreciate the compliment. But before anyone could speak further, another voice interrupted. This is unacceptable. A tall Zerrin warrior stepped forward, his expression dark. He was General Kaylor, one of the most powerful military leaders in the Empire. His silver armor gleamed under the arena lights. Zyra stiffened. She knew Kaylor well. He was ruthless, traditional, and he despised humans. Kaylor's eyes burned with anger. This human should not be honored. He is an outsider, a lesser being, and yet you call him worthy. The crowd fell silent. Many Zerrin agreed with Kaylor's views. They believed humans were weak, unworthy of standing beside their kind. Elias sighed. Here we go again. Zyra stepped forward. General, Elias has already proven himself in battle. Are you questioning the High Commander's decision? Kaylor sneered. I am questioning the wisdom of honoring a human at all. He turned to the commander. This cannot stand. The princess must prove herself again, against a true opponent. Zyra narrowed her eyes. Are you suggesting you should fight me? Kaylor smirked. No, princess. I suggest that he fights me. The air in the arena grew heavy. Another battle. Against Kaylor. Elias looked at the towering warrior, who was even larger than Zyra. His muscles were like steel, his stance firm. He wasn't just a warrior. He was a war machine. Zyra clenched her fists. This is unnecessary. Elias already fought with honor. Kaylor's eyes gleamed with challenge. Then let him prove it again. The High Commander remained silent for a long moment. Then, at last, he spoke. Very well. The human shall fight Kaylor. Zyra turned sharply. Commander. But Elias raised a hand. It's fine, princess. He grinned. I never back down from a challenge. Kaylor smirked. Then prepare yourself, human. Because this time, you won't walk away so easily. Elias tightened his grip on his sword. He could feel it. This battle was going to be different. This wasn't just a fight. It was war. The arena had fallen into an uneasy silence. Kaylor's challenge was more than just words. It was a threat. Elias could feel the tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This fight would not be like the last one. Across from him stood General Kaylor, his massive form towering over Elias. His silver armor shone brightly in the light, and his eyes gleamed with cold confidence. Elias had faced many battles, but this was different. Kaylor was a beast, a warrior forged for war. Elias took a deep breath. He had faced Princess Zyra's strength, but now he was about to face a man who lived for the battlefield. The High Commander stepped forward, his voice steady and authoritative. The rules remain the same. No weapons other than swords. The battle will continue until one fighter yields. Zyra looked at Elias, concern written on her face. Are you sure about this? Elias nodded. I don't back down. Kaylor's laughter echoed in the arena. Brave words, human, but they won't save you. Elias gripped his sword tighter, ready for whatever Kaylor had in store. His mind raced, thinking of every strategy he had learned, every tactic he had used in the past. Kaylor charged first, his speed terrifying. He swung his sword with incredible force, aiming to crush Elias with the power of his blow. Elias barely managed to step aside, the air from the swing grazing his cheek. Kaylor didn't pause. He pressed the attack, his sword strikes coming in fast and brutal, each one with the intent to end the fight in a single blow. Elias had to think quickly, or he wouldn't last. Sidestep, dodge, counter. Elias moved with purpose, letting Kaylor's strength overextend. He ducked low as Kaylor's sword slammed into the ground where he had just been. He had to wear Kaylor down. The general was powerful, but his attacks were starting to slow as his heavy movements exhausted him. Not bad, human, Kaylor growled, his voice filled with frustration. But your speed won't save you forever. Elias smirked, sweat trickling down his forehead. You're right about one thing. Speed is my edge. Kaylor roared and swung again, faster this time. But Elias had already anticipated it. He ducked low, using the momentum of Kaylor's strike against him. With one swift movement, Elias rolled behind Kaylor and, with his sword raised, struck at the general's side. Kaylor grunted in pain as Elias's blade sliced through his armor. The crowd gasped. Zyra stood frozen, watching the battle unfold. She had never seen anyone land a blow on Kaylor. Elias was holding his ground, and she couldn't believe it. The general stumbled, but he quickly recovered, his rage growing. He turned to face Elias, his eyes burning with fury. "You think you can defeat me? You're nothing more than a pest." Elias stood tall, his chest heaving with each breath. "I'm more than that. I'm the one who's going to prove humans aren't weak." Kaylor's eyes widened for a moment, the challenge in Elias's voice striking a chord within him. But the general wasn't someone who would back down. Not now, not ever. He charged again, but this time, Elias was ready. Elias met the attack head-on, his sword raised high. He caught Kaylor's blade with his own, blocking the strike with all his might. The clash of steel rang through the arena, and the shock of the impact nearly made Elias's arms buckle. But he didn't give up. He had trained for moments like this. With a roar, Elias pushed Kaylor back, creating just enough space. He darted in, using his agility to his advantage, striking at Kaylor's side again. This time, the blow was deeper. Kaylor grunted, his armor dented, but his anger only seemed to grow. "You will fall," Kaylor screamed. But Elias didn't hesitate. He had no time for words. His sword was now an extension of his will, and each strike came with the intent to survive. He was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for humanity. Kaylor stumbled once more, his movements slowing. The once proud general was beginning to show signs of weakness. Elias could see it. He could feel it. This was his moment. With one final surge of energy, Elias leaped forward, dodging Kaylor's wild swing. He spun around and, in a flash of movement, drove his sword into the general's side, just beneath the armor. Kaylor's eyes widened in disbelief. He fell to his knees, the pain overwhelming him. The arena was silent. Elias stood over Kaylor, panting, his sword still in hand. He hadn't won with strength alone. He had won with his mind, his will, and his determination. He had shown that even the strongest warriors had their limits. The High Commander stepped forward, his face unreadable. He looked down at the fallen Kaylor, and then back at Elias. "The battle is over. The human has won." Zyra's heart swelled with pride as she watched Elias. She had seen many warriors in her life, but never one like him. Elias had done what no Zerrin could have. He had defeated the undefeatable. She approached him, her gaze full of respect. "You did it." Elias wiped his forehead, his eyes meeting hers. "I didn't do it alone. The human spirit is strong." And with that, Elias Carter had shown the galaxy that humans were not to be underestimated. The arena was still, the silence pressing down on everyone. The echoes of the battle seemed to fade into nothingness as Elias stood, his sword raised above the fallen form of General Kaylor. The crowd was motionless, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The strongest Zerrin warrior had been defeated by a human. Elias was breathing heavily, his muscles aching. The fight had drained him, but the adrenaline was still running through his veins. He stood over Kaylor, who was still kneeling, unable to rise. The once mighty warrior had fallen, and it was at the hands of a human. Zyra stepped forward, her eyes locked on Elias. She had seen him fight with unmatched skill and courage, and now she saw something else, the spirit of a true warrior. She bowed her head slightly. "You've done the impossible, Elias." Elias wiped the sweat from his brow and looked down at Kaylor, who was still struggling to breathe. "I didn't do it alone. I just used my mind and my will. That's what humans do best." A High Commander moved toward them, his gaze shifting from Kaylor to Elias. "The battle is over. The human has proven himself beyond doubt. The crowd erupted into murmurs. Some still couldn't believe what they had just seen. How could a human defeat Kaylor, a warrior with decades of experience? But the truth was undeniable. Elias had won, and now the entire arena had to come to terms with it. Kaylor finally managed to rise, his face filled with anger and humiliation. He looked at Elias with a mix of disbelief and hatred. This is a disgrace," he shouted, his voice hoarse. But Elias didn't flinch. He had earned his victory, and he would stand tall. "The disgrace?" Elias asked, his voice steady. "You're the one who underestimated me. The one who thought I was nothing more than an obstacle to your pride." Kaylor glared at him, but he knew, deep down, that Elias had won fair and square. The battle had been hard-fought, and the human had proven his worth. "I will not forget this," Kaylor spat, stumbling to his feet. "But know this, human, the next time we meet, it will be different." Elias didn't reply. He didn't need to. His actions had already spoken louder than words ever could. Zyra turned to the High Commander, her eyes filled with determination. "We can't let this victory be overshadowed by Kaylor's pride. The Zerrin must understand that we are equals, and that humanity is not a force to be taken lightly." The High Commander nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right, Princess. The time has come for change. The way we view humans must change." Zyra stepped closer to Elias. "You've done more than win a fight, Elias. You've opened the door for a future where our people stand side by side. A future where strength isn't defined by size or age, but by heart and determination." Elias smiled, the exhaustion in his face softening. "I didn't come here to change the galaxy. I came to survive. And you've done that." The words rang in Elias's ears as he looked around at the arena. The cheering had begun, a slow rumble at first, then growing louder, as if the entire world was waking up to what had just happened. A human warrior had defeated one of the greatest Zerrin fighters in existence. As the cheers grew, Zyra stepped forward and raised her hand to silence the crowd. The arena quieted. Let this moment be a new beginning. The beginning of cooperation, of understanding. She turned to Elias. "This victory isn't just yours. It belongs to all humans who have fought for their place in the universe." Elias nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had come here as an outsider, someone who had been underestimated, but now he was something more. He was a symbol of what humans could achieve when they didn't give up, when they believed in their own strength. The High Commander raised his hand to signal the end of the contest. "Let this be known across the galaxy. Humans are no longer just survivors. They are warriors, they are equals, and they are to be respected." Zyra smiled at Elias, a deep respect in her eyes. "You have done more than any one of us could have imagined. You have changed the course of our history." Elias looked out at the crowd, the cheers echoing in his ears. But more than that, he felt the weight of what he had just accomplished. He had shown the galaxy that humanity was capable of greatness, that their strength was not measured by size, but by their hearts. As he looked back at Zyra, he knew their fight was just beginning. It wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was about building a future, one where humans and Zerrin could stand together. And this was just the start.